Okay, a very good afternoon to the audience. I'm aware that it's now the afternoon, and so the caffeine and the other stimulants that the hackers may or may not be on might be wearing off. I'll try and make this as entertaining as possible. I must admit, I feel like somewhat of an outsider here. I'm not a hacker, I'm not a developer, I'm not any of these other kinds of words that have been tossed around today. I'm a social science researcher by training, and I thought that the best way to start this talk would be to introduce your community, the Ethereum community, to my community. I'm from the Illawarra region in Australia, which is on the southeast coast, around 2 hours south of Sydney. And we have white sandy beaches, we have rolling meadows, we have really quiet, lovely coastal towns, a really high quality of life that we're privileged to be a part of. But nonetheless, in the year 2020, our community was reeling from a series of really tragic events where 14 young people within the space of just a handful of months took their lives. And something that emerged from this was a big discussion in our community around, you know, what's going on? If we have such a good quality of life here, why is it that young people and people in the community in general don't feel like they can talk to anyone about their struggles? Why is it that we're having these kinds of outcomes when if someone was to come forward and to express what they're going through, there would be support for it? And so there were a range of different grassroots organizations that formed in the wake of this, and others that were running for a bit longer picked up more momentum. I wanted to give a special shout out to Talk to Me Bro in particular, which is one organization that I was a part of, and they do amazing work going into workplaces, into schools and other venues around the community and now around Australia to really break the stigma around mental health and to really break the stigma around suicide. Nevertheless, these kinds of events also triggered another discussion in our community, which is what effect is technology having on us as individuals and on us as a community? Because at the time, we were starting to come to terms with reports like this one, where it was found through insider reports that Facebook had incredibly granular information about the psychological profile of young people in Australia in particular, but of all of us, of course, and that information was being monetized, and that very personal, private kind of profiling that is, you know, more impactful, or those companies knew more about the struggles of these young people than maybe their parents did, and what were they doing with it, right? So there were a lot of these discussions taking place. I was at the time into my PhD, which was leading me down some of the rabbit hole of compulsive social media use and harms to youth, but also some of these broader macro challenges that are much more in the limelight these days, such as misinformation, etc. And so I teamed up with the fellow that you can see standing beside me here in the top left, Jade Hutchinson, who's now a postdoctoral researcher at the Australian National University in Australia. And we engaged the community. We conducted a lot of workshops, a lot of lectures. We wanted to bring an intergenerational cohort of people from the community into shared spaces, so young people, school principals, teachers, and the elderly members of our society to have an honest conversation about how these platforms actually work, because films like The Social Dilemma, I think, had only just come out, and so it was still very much kind of an academic kind of regulatory debate that hadn't really entered the mainstream discourse yet. And so we really wanted to bring this into more of a community setting and to try and talk with one another and come up with ways of protecting ourselves, protecting our young people from the kind of manipulative techniques that I'm going to be speaking about. We also partnered up with the Nantian Institute, which is a higher education institute and temple in Australia, in the Illawarra. It's one of the biggest outside of Taiwan, and it gives degrees in humanistic Buddhism. So we teamed up with them and we did a number of lectures online. This is one that is still on YouTube for those that are still interested. This also led Jade and I to meet Professor Jonathan Haidt, whose New York Times bestseller, The Anxious Generation, has really been at the forefront of this movement. Jonathan really an amazing person. At the time, he was actually coordinating a Google Doc where researchers like Jade and I and others from around the world could access this, could share their experiences working with communities, and also to keep up to date with all of the new research that was coming out around social media use and mental health outcomes, etc. Jade and I wrote about some of these experiences on different occasions, such as in this one edited volume on the right here that you can see. And one of the recommendations that we were making then at the time was the age gating of social media in Australia and more broadly speaking. Now, of course, Australia has since become one of the first countries in the world to actually adopt that as a policy. And so for us, that really served to confirm the untapped, latent civic intelligence that there is in communities, that when you actually bring people together and you bring them in the space and you say, like, these are how these things work, that there's a massive amount of knowledge and a massive amount of solutions that can be brought to bear on some of these challenges that sometimes feel like they're totally out of the control of any kind of grassroots community to solve. So that's a little bit about my background. And now, what are we talking about? Before engaging with the harms, I thought it would be worth being precise about what we're actually talking about. So this term social media, it's often used to describe everything from WhatsApp to Wikipedia. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm trying to keep that definition intentional and bounded. And the key feature that distinguishes the platforms that I'm concerned about in this talk is that it's algorithmic curation that's in the service of engagement maximization. So to understand these terms that get thrown around these days, like the attention economy and surveillance capitalism, we might first go back to Herbert Simon, who was postulating, okay, in the 1970s, that humanity was now entering this phase in which it wouldn't be a poverty of information that we would be suffering, but actually a glut of information. What happens when we enter a world in which there's too much information for our Paleolithic minds and brains to deal with? What happens then? And Herbert Simon was saying that in that context, it's attention that becomes scarce, and that the allocation of attention therefore becomes a central, practical, and ethical problem. And so social media platforms' answer to this problem was not ethical, but commercial. It was to maximize engagement as a proxy for attention capture as a means of maximizing shareholder value. So Shoshana Zuboff later came out in 2015 and later in her book, Surveillance Capitalism in 2019. And she traced what she calls surveillance capitalism back to the dot-com crash in 2000, where it's kind of similar to the AI scene that you see today. There's a lot of speculation around what kind of companies are going to be the next big thing, which companies are going to make the big bucks, right? And so at that time, a lot of these internet companies weren't actually producing any meaningful revenue. So there's a number of reasons. It's quite complicated, but there was a bubble that formed in the stock market, and this led to the bubble bursting and a lot of these early internet companies going broke. Now, at the time, Google executives, faced with this existential crisis, realized, hold on a second, we can actually use data exhaust, which is a euphemism that their engineers had come up with for all of the data that is generated from a user using Google services. So this is like what they type into a search bar, what they're searching for, but also what they type in and then delete. You know, this is dwell times, these are these kinds of metrics, right, that we're kind of unaware that we're even producing. Now, data exhaust in and of itself isn't bad. That's used to also refine services, right? So it's also necessary in a way. But they realized at the time that, okay, faced with this existential crisis, we can take that, we can package that as a new commodity form, because it's going to reveal incredibly granular information about a person. So we can create these virtual profiles, package them and sell them to advertisers, because advertisers have always wanted to know the hearts and minds of consumers. And so later, with the advent of the first social media companies such as Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg they realized that, okay, we can take this model and we could create a gated community whereby we encourage people to participate and to, participate in this simulation of social connection. But why would they encourage that? It's because also, yes, maybe they want to connect the world, but they want to connect the world because that'll also produce a hell of a lot of data that they can use to fund this kind of surveillance capitalism. And so it's operating here on two levels. There's economies of scale, where you want as many users as possible because that's going to generate as much data as possible. And so this is why Facebook so generously, like a few years ago, was giving developing countries it was building them free internet infrastructure in exchange for them to become Facebook users, right? So that's one example of them working towards these economies of scale. If you have economies of scale, that means that you have lock-in, that means that you have people fear of missing out because all of their friends and family are on the networks, right? But you also want economies of scope. So you don't just want everyone in the same place so you can maximize all this data that you're generating, but you also want to vary the kinds of data and information about people as much as possible. And so this is illustrated here on this one point here, where early on, Facebook was only using kind of 3 variables to determine like what you would see on your homepage on Facebook. And over the course of 3 years, they started to use 10,000 different variables. So that shows how much granular information, how many different kinds of information that they were starting to extract from people increasingly. Now, this kind of a model leads to the flywheel. So this describes that as recommendation algorithms become more powerful, the kind of engagement that they generate increases, and that's also strongly correlated with the exploding revenues of these companies. So you can see that here in the early 2010s, when social media went mobile, that meant that users could start to access the platforms from wherever, and that would generate a lot more data. Then also there was the introduction of the like button, these kinds of different reactions like anger and wow, these kinds of things were added. Of course, yeah, this is a way for you to express yourself online, but it's also a fantastic way that you can tell the company, this is what makes me angry, this is what keeps me engaged, right? And so there's a number of changes like this where other companies also were starting to develop similar systems, and where, for example, in 2021, you had Douyin or TikTok who realized that, okay, maybe we can just show people short videos, and then as people are watching the short videos, we're just going to be purely looking at how long they watch the videos for, when they stop, when they skip to another video, and they realize that, wow, this is an incredibly powerful way to maximize engagement, and that's illustrated by the fact that TikTok has the highest average monthly use of any platform. But in addition to that, when this kind of model was rolled out across the social media ecosystem, that YouTube and Instagram, for example, saw massive increases in engagement. So for example, Instagram adopted that kind of AI Reels model, and they saw a 24% increase in the amount of engagement, right? So this is a flywheel here where more data is equaling ever more precise means of recommending certain content that's going to keep you scrolling, and that engagement feeds over into these burgeoning revenues of these companies. So why might all of this be problematic? To answer that question, I wanted to share with you my fledgling knowledge about Buddhism and about the Buddhist view of attention. So it might seem a little bit esoteric that I'm bringing this up here, because the Buddhist account of attention predates the attention economy by about 2,500 years. And it was developed in a context where the primary threat to clear attention was internal. You might have heard these words like craving and aversion, distraction, the wandering mind. What the contemporary situation adds, though, is external distraction that is engineered at scale. It's optimized in real time against your specific psychological profile and financially incentivized to be as difficult to resist as possible. So this Buddhist view of attention is closely tied to the notion of karma, which is also quite misunderstood in the West. It's formative rather than just being about retribution. So it's not just that bad actors get punished, but that repeated actions of any kind shape character, perception, and future response. And so if we think about modern neuroscience, you might have heard the expression that neurons that fire together wire together. So this is actually confirmation of this process on the level of the brain. It's the notion that what we're paying attention to on a daily basis, what we continue to do with our attention on a daily basis, it will make the related actions easier and easier to do and more automatic, more thoughtless. So every time you reach for your phone without deciding to, you're not just passing time, you are practicing. You are rehearsing a particular relationship between impulse and action and making it more automatic. So the platform is not neutral in this process. It's designed to shorten the gap between impulse and action as much as possible. And there are 3 compounding harms that follow from this. The attention economy poses a distinctive ethical concern because it intervenes directly in the formation of our intentions. So firstly, we have this kind of simulation of social connection which has been promoted. We're a social species. We have a profound evolutionary need for validation, esteem, and connection. And social media companies identified this proclivity and built a business model around it. So what we're getting from the platform, it is connection in a way, but more importantly, it's the simulation of connection. It's engineered to satisfy just enough of our craving for that, that we're trained not to seek the real thing, or to at least become accustomed to receiving this kind of simulation of connection. And so we also are experiencing what some researchers are calling an intimacy deficit, where, for example, Buddhist ethics, going back to that, is grounded in the recognition that the self is not a discrete, isolated entity, but we are constituted through our relationships and interdependencies. And so the attention economy degrades this relational fabric in 2 ways. First, by incentivizing this online over in-person interaction, right? You could imagine that social media could be designed in such a way that after a certain time of scrolling, that there's a message that comes up on your screen and says, like, these are other friends in your area that are free, that you could be directed towards in-person interactions, right? But they choose not to do that because they want to keep you on the platform. So the second consequence is that it's also creating these echo chambers because it's delivering content that's calibrated entirely to individual preferences. So the third element to these harms is the cognitive capture, where the attention fragmentation that we're all experiencing, I mean, I'm using these platforms, I certainly experience like attention fragmentation now in such a way that I didn't in previous years, but that's degrading the very cognitive faculties that we need to resist this. So scale is just compounding all of this. And I heard a quote from the cognitive neuroscientist Earl Miller the other day that who was said to say that we are living in the perfect storm of cognitive degradation. I'm not going to spend too much time with this. There's a lot of references. I can share these slides with everyone after this talk, but I just wanted to point out to a few of the most egregious findings in this space. A 2 times higher risk of depression and anxiety, above 3 hours of social media use a day for teenagers, 13% increase in self-harm risk in girls for every 30 extra minutes on social media, and 46% of teens saying social media makes them feel worse about their body image. But of course, this is not just the kids, this is all of us. So there's evidence that daily posting can be linked to worse mental health outcomes the following year in adults, where 78% of studies are finding heavy or compulsive social media use raises depression, anxiety, and loneliness in adults. And we have, again, this deteriorating attention from this AI Reels type model, this short-form video content, where short-form video content is consistently impairing our attention, impairing our ability to premediate, to set long-term goals and to stick to those goals, and where just 30 minutes of short-form video content is enough to impair such goal-directed thinking. But of course, I'm not just talking at an individual level, I'm also talking at a societal level, where we have the spread of false news and misinformation on such platforms, where hundreds of studies are linking social media to declining political trust, rising populism, and growing polarization. And that content on social media that confirms what people already believe is pushing people more and more from the center, so more and more from our ability to relate with people with differing opinions. So now the real paradox. There's this phrase that research is me search, and one of the things that's been really hard for me personally over the past few years studying this is that I'm not somehow immune to all of this, and I'm on these platforms, and I've seen how the techniques that I'm describing here have really started to impact me, my values, and my attention. The other thing is that there are incredibly powerful forces here where we have these large companies that will do everything in their power to obfuscate themselves of any kind of responsibility. They've shown time and time again that they're just going to tout the benefits and push all of these harms under the rug and leave them for civil society to absorb. So here are some solutions that I'm positing. I know I was told I have 3 minutes. I have 5 minutes here, as said, so I'm going to stick to the 5 minutes here. But each of these pillars that I'm presenting here operationalizes this Buddhist insight that attention shapes who we become. So the architecture reforms restore the conditions for chosen attention. The governance encodes communal values about what is worth attending to. And cultivation is building this inner capacity for us to choose. It's widening the space between stimulus and response. So first, we need to break the lock-in. We're accepting a lot of these exploitative terms because all of our contacts are on the platform, and this scale is what's creating the captivity. It's the largest platforms that have no real attention to change because they've achieved these economies of scale. So interoperability is one thing that I know would probably be discussed here in this context of this conference, but it would be the idea that your social graph belongs to you, that you have the ability to message between various platforms, and that platforms have to compete whether they serve users well, rather than just on how effective they are at capturing users and keeping them on one platform. Now, work on interoperability and cross-platform messaging has shown that it actually can create new vectors of harm of spam, harassment, and coordinated inauthentic behavior that is harder to moderate when the sender is on a different platform. So federated moderation is a genuine unresolved problem, but ultimately, though, the alternative of leaving moderation entirely in the hands of platforms whose financial interests are misaligned with safety is not obviously better. Secondly, I think that we need to start thinking about aligning values at every level, and I want everyone to think really hard about this bottom left question that I posited here, is that if a lot of these issues have arisen from short-term attention capture, how could recommendation algorithms be giving us information that's better serving our long-term interests, our long-term goals that we set for ourselves, and our overall human flourishing and the flourishing of our communities? Now, there are different value frameworks that we could look to potentially for inspiration. For example, at the international level, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are an example of member states having come together and agreed on long-term attentional priorities. At the national level, China's 2021 law on recommendation algorithms specifies that recommendation algorithms cannot contravene the core socialist values, which are a set of 12 virtues that are publicized everywhere in China. Some of my other research is on that, so you can get me back here next year if you want to hear more about that. But anyway, the final level that I wanted to point to is that we need to have some kind of dialogue between these levels. It can't just be about a blanket imposition of a value framework from the UN or a national government, that we need to think about these questions on a community level. One good example would be Taiwan, which is Taiwan's civic deliberation platform, and that's been running since 2015, and that's really inverting this traditional recommendation logic. Rather than surfacing the most divisive content to keep people engaged, the algorithm maps where citizens genuinely converge across political lines, and it's actually been used to shape actual legislation on Uber regulation, on online alcohol sales, etc. So that's a proof that algorithmic curation can be governed by democratically set values rather than engagement metrics. But also, on a longer term horizon, we need to start thinking about who should have the right to stewardship the data in the first place. And in this report that we submitted to the UN, we were saying that it shouldn't be states or platforms, but potentially data intermediaries that have fiduciary obligations to the communities where the data is coming from. And that, you could imagine that in the context of the Illawarra, for example, that a community data intermediary receives these anonymized signals of distress, and that school counsellors are the ones that are notified, and local mental health workers can stage an intervention. So the data is serving the community that it came from and not a platform in California. I've just got one more slide after this. So the final pillar is this cultivation pillar, where I differentiate between triage measures and cultivation measures. I'll speak here to the cultivation measures, where we need to be thinking about how we can build capacity in us as individuals and how we can widen this space between stimulus and response. Now, that might introduce a little bit of discomfort on our behalf, because we've been trained for immediate gratification, for the thrill of short-term attention, and what it actually might require is algorithms that slow feeds and that surface dissenting views and prompt reflection before sharing.
Sorry, we really need to close.
Sure. So the final question that I wanted to posit here is a very personal one, but at the same time it's one that we cannot answer alone. Social media has real benefits. I'm not saying that it doesn't, and in a lot of instances it does connect people who might never have gotten the chance to meet otherwise. But I just don't want us to be tricked into believing that the necessary price is the repeated violation of our privacy, the fracturing of our attention, and the degradation of our human dignity. So do we want recommendation algorithms and technology in general to hijack and undermine our psychological vulnerabilities, or to empower and elevate the better angels of our nature? I thank you all so much for the kind of undivided attention it takes to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Eye-opening insights. Very important ones indeed. We have a quick lightning talk now. Next up.